So thank you very, very much again for being here this evening. Tonight's event is being brought to you by the Oregon Community Rights Network. It's also being co-hosted by the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And our topic tonight is on preemption or state preemption or state ceiling preemption. The panelists may have other terms for what we mean here. And I think we're going to have a great evening based on who we have here tonight. And again, appreciate everyone being here. For those that don't know anything about the Oregon Community Rights Network, it is a 501c3 that formed in 2014. Its intention is to help communities really build viable local democracy, especially when it comes to protecting their health, safety, and welfare. Has been doing so again since 2014. It's primarily working on education, trainings, events like this, and other grassroots organizing support at the community level. And CELDEF, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit law firm that has been assisting communities in places like Oregon and elsewhere, largely against the overreach of things like state preemption and corporate privilege, trying to embolden communities really to formulate a government that really recognizes local authority to protect, again, health, safety, and welfare, and has been in existence now for 25 years. Before we get to a quick overview of tonight and introducing the panelists, I just also want to give a special thanks to Jennifer Pomerantz. She's a professor at NYU. She was invited to be here this evening. She specializes in public health and has done quite a bit of work in relation to preemption and public health. She was very kind to put together a short video about state preemption. And you can find that on the ORCRN.org website if you haven't seen that yet. So I invite you to do that after tonight. Again, tonight's topic is really looking at this idea of preemption and how it really affects our communities from all kinds of vantage points, whether you're talking about development, health issues, gun safety, agricultural issues, energy issues. It really has run the gamut. We thought tonight, with the people we've invited to be here, we would cover questions about, what is it even? How does it work? Where does it come from? What's sort of been its trajectory over the last couple decades or even in the last few years? And then really start to dig into what it really means down at the community level in our day-to-day lives, whether we're talking about food systems or policing or development or whatever it may be. That this is a very real issue and it really affects our lives. So we'll dig into all of that this evening, and hopefully we'll have some great questions coming from you throughout the process. I'm going to move to introducing who we have here tonight, and we'll hear from them because this is why you're here. Our first person I want to introduce is a gentleman by the name of Lindsay Schroman Warren. Lindsay is an attorney in Washington State. He's also a city council member in his hometown of Port Angeles, Washington. It's a small city on the edge of the Salish Sea in the Olympic Mountains, in the historic territory of the Clallam people. His law practice focuses on the issues of relative power of governments, corporations, and the people, specifically state interference with local democracy. His clients include the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund and the Lake Erie ecosystem. We also have joining us tonight Mark Pertschuk. Mark is the director of Grassroots Change and the Preemption Watch Project. He's the former president, executive director of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights and the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation. While he was with both organizations, he managed grassroots campaigns for the federal airline smoking ban and state and local tobacco control laws in dozens of states. In 1995, Mark co-founded Californians for Responsible Gun Laws, a grassroots policy advocacy group. As its executive director, he managed a successful grassroots movement for more than 40 local gun control ordinances and 3 major statewide firearm and ammunition laws. And from 1999 to 2002, he served as legislative director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence in Washington, D.C., and a senior advisor to the Million Mom March. Last but not least, we have Tim Gibbons. Tim has been working for the Missouri Rural Crisis Center for over 15 years. The Missouri Rural Crisis Center is a statewide farm and rural membership organization founded in 1985 Tim organizes with Missouri family farmers, rural citizens, and other concerns with our food system and democratic process. MRCC's mission is to preserve family farms, promote stewardship of the land and environmental integrity, and strive for economic and social justice by building unity and mutual understanding among diverse groups, both rural and urban. Their approach to family farm organizing includes challenging corporate control of the food supply, creating sustainable alternatives to the current farm and food system, and generating community participation to create a just democratic society based on equity and fairness of all people. Lindsay, Mark, and Tim, thank you again very much for being here. Tim, especially since you're a couple hours ahead of us. I really appreciate you making the time to be here this evening. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lindsay first to really talk about this idea of what is preemption, where it comes from, some of the basics, and whatever else you'd like to add into that. Then we'll hear from Mark and then from Tim. I asked our speakers to maybe spend 10 to 15 minutes each presenting, and then we'll move into questions from you here tonight. So I will now hand it off to Lindsay.
Thanks, Kai, and it's really great to see a lot of names I recognize coming in through the waiting room or in this meeting. So thank you all for being here, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel. About an hour ago, my partner asked me, so what are you talking about tonight? What's this thing you're doing? I'm like, oh, I'm on a panel to talk about preemption. And she's like, you can stop right there. That sounds really boring. So everybody get your head checked because something's wrong with you for being here. But it really is this issue that affects us in very concrete ways. Like we right now are dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, and it's escalating pretty rapidly. States are setting laws. Can local governments put in stricter protections than what the state allows? What if the state says, hey, city cannot have a mask mandate? Should the state be allowed to do that? These are the sort of questions that preemption implicates for us, but it's not just on an epidemic issue. It's really one of these issues that affects whatever passionate issue we have, whatever subject matter we're trying to make changes on in policy. Preemption is one of those structural tools that controls how people behave. So an example or a story I want to tell about that is around the minimum wage. And I think minimum wage law is one of those spots where it's kind of easy to introduce the concept of preemption. So there's a federal minimum wage, and that sets a minimum amount that people can be paid per hour. And the federal law, though, says this is not the only minimum wage, that like local governments, state governments, they can set their own minimum wages too, basically as long as they're higher than the federal minimum wage. So the federal minimum wage forms this floor. Then some states set their own minimum wages, and they set a minimum wage that can be higher than that. If it's lower, it's it doesn't really do anything. And that higher minimum wage then sometimes will say, as in the case in Washington where I live, that cities and counties and other local governments, well, really just cities and counties, can set their own minimum wage. So several years ago, people in the area around SeaTac, Washington, said, we're going to fight for $15 an hour minimum wage. And they began to organize. They picked SeaTac in particular because it's where an international airport is. And they were successful in getting the city to put in place a higher minimum wage than what the state had. And that organizing effort in SeaTac really led in a lot of ways to the national Fight for 15 movement, which recently had a win in Florida, where the voters of Florida voted yes for 15-hour minimum wage. In the same election where the majority of them seem to have voted against that interest in the presidential vote. But why did that start in SeaTac? Why did that start in Washington? Why didn't that start in Oregon, y'all? You're organizers, you're serious about this stuff too. And the reason is preemption, because the Oregon minimum wage law says, quote, the state of Oregon preempts all charter and statutory authority of local governments to set any minimum wage requirements, end quote. So the federal law sets the floor. The state law goes higher than that. And certainly there's a minimum wage law in Oregon, and it is higher than the federal minimum wage. But then that state law stops the local laws from going forward. It basically sets not what we say a floor, it actually sets a ceiling. It pushes down on any local organizing and any local lawmaking that's going to experiment and be based on local conditions. So that's an example of preemption in practice and an example of how preemption changes our behavior, because the Fight for 15 movement in Oregon said, they didn't say, let's work in some cities or counties and organize and move forward with $15 an hour, started the grassroots, which is how we know a lot of change happens in the United States. Instead, they said, okay, well, let's work for state law change, because the state legislature had made that the only option available to them. So it was structural, and it controlled the organizers' behavior. And it's not just minimum wage, and really it's not just economic issues. Employment scheduling, protections, paid sick leave are also economic justice issues that Oregon preempts. Last year, the state of Oregon introduced rent control, which is an important measure for stabilizing housing markets and ensuring more affordable housing. But the legislature also put into that provision a preemption clause. And that one says, quote, a city or county shall not enact any ordinance or resolution which controls the rent that may be charged for the rental of any dwelling unit, end quote. So that little sentence right there means that people in, say, Portland, for example, who might say, our housing market is very different than the state housing market, than the housing market in other parts of Oregon, and we need to customize this law to fit our local needs. They don't have that power based on state preemption in Oregon, based on that one phrase in state law that the legislature put in place last year. So, why does this happen? What's going on really is state interference with local democracy. One of the things that we like, or I think we should like, about our system of government is that it allows for experimentation. It allows for people in different places to say, these are the laws that are going to serve us best. This is how we're going to protect our rights, health, safety, and welfare. And, that might not be what everyone else is doing, but we're going to try it. And, sometimes that doesn't work. And, everyone else fortunately didn't go down that path. And sometimes it works. And we say, great, let's try that in other places as well. But preemption cuts off that experimentation potential. And it basically says there's a one size fits all solution when our democratic system isn't really built that way. There's an argument, Justice Brandeis used to make that argument before the US Supreme Court, at the beginning of the 20th century, that, there's experimentation between the 50 different states, and each state should have that flexibility to choose its own policies. But that argument was being made decades earlier than Brandeis by local government reformers who were advocating for local governments as the hope of democracy for our system of law. So, why are state legislatures doing this? A lot of it has to do with corporate control. So I'll tell another story, and that is with Oregon law as well, with the Oregon Pesticide Control Act. In the 1980s, a lot of local governments were passing pesticide laws that were stricter than federal law at the time. The pesticide industry brought a lawsuit claiming that those local laws were preempted by the federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, and the corporate interests lost in federal court. The US Supreme Court said, no, actually, this federal act does not preempt these local laws. Oh no, what do you do? Well, we can't have all these local laws going forward. The corporate folks advocate, this is a patchwork of regulation, and we can't live with this. When really what it is it's people saying, yeah, no, we actually don't like being poisoned, and we're going to pass laws for that. And what we find is at the local level, our lawmakers are more receptive to our needs, and that's been found empirically in studies as well. And so, the pesticide industry said, well, let's go to the state legislatures. And they went to the state legislatures and passed preemption acts. But they don't just do this like without coordination. They had coordination tools in the 90s with pesticide preemption in the form of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or Alec, which I think many people are familiar with. And Alec in 1994 put out a model pesticide preemption act. And in the same year, the state of Oregon adopted that model pesticide preemption act with the intent statute and the preemption statute almost word for word what what Alec had put forward as a model bill. So today, or several years ago, out on the coast, Lincoln County prohibited aerial spraying of pesticides, and the pesticide industry, with some local fronts, brought a lawsuit against Lincoln County saying you can't do that. It's preempted by the Oregon Pesticide Control Act. And that case is still in court, but the trial judge ruled that, hey, preemption, state law trumps local law when the two come in conflict. And the state law says you can't regulate this. So that is really what it comes down to today, is that the courts have a very simple interpretation of preemption law, which is federal law trumps state law trumps local law. If they come into conflict, or if the higher level of government says that it's preempting the entire field. And in some areas, we're really not concerned about this. Is it fine for the federal government to preempt the field of airline traffic regulation and air traffic control? None of us are arguing that states should have a role in air traffic control in that way, right? But when it's coming to the conditions that people are facing locally, and things that protect people's health, safety, welfare, and rights, that people should have the ability to make laws that they need. I think I'll pause there and turn it over to Mark or Tim, whoever's next. But I'm happy to come back and revisit any of these ideas and talk more about origins and history if people want to. But since preemption is super boring, it doesn't. It's a matter of history. I'll stop before I put everyone to sleep.
Lindsay, thank you very much. We're actually going to hand it over to Mark now, and then Tim will round us out. And as I said earlier, we'll ideally have lots of time to kind of dig into specific questions. And I've been monitoring chat for those that are listening and grabbing questions out of the chat. So we'll get to those once we hear from Mark and then Tim.
First of all, I really appreciate the two organizations that have made this possible, and every single individual here. I agree with Lindsay, obviously, that preemption as a legal and a technical concept can be boring, especially to our loved ones. However, I think to many of us, if not all of us, it's an issue of great passion, because preemption has been used, and it's being used progressively to destroy local democracy, which in a sense means in many areas that we're concerned about destroying democracy, period. I think all of us would agree that this is if not the most important time in our history, a critical time in our history to preserve what democracy we have. And so with that, I'm going to give you something which I hope won't be very boring, and we can get to Tim's stuff, which I think is very, very important as well. So I'm going to attempt to bring up a short presentation. And I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, because I think there's people, if there's questions, you can ask them. Many people who are participating in this can know about this stuff as well, and we can share with each other. So there you go. So this is who I am, and my group, Grassroots Change, was founded in 2009, and I want to present this just as the basis for what we're doing. That there's a kind of a science behind this, as well as the reality that we live in dealing with state, local, federal policies. Our project was started, and the first thing we did was to reach out and do some kind of grassroots research, if you will, all over the country with advocates for public health issues and all of these issues that are listed here, from alcohol to toxic chemicals. The folks that we talked to had experience in one or more of them. So what we learned about preemption and about local control and about grassroots movements applies. I saw this in the chat already. It's relevant to dozens and dozens of issues. And so, first of all, our major grassroots changes major project is the Preemption Watch project. And it's, if you're interested, it's at preemptionwatch.org, and you can find fact sheets and myths, myths and facts and things like that. I would encourage you to do that. This is what we've done. We track a lot of issues, but we really, with our preemption map, we've looked at 8 issues that are listed here. And if you go to our preemption map at preemptionwatch.org, for example, and you click on firearms, it will give you a list of, it'll show every single state with a link to the actual statute that's preemptive. It's not that boring because we've done very short blurbs on each state, and then you take you to folks who work on those issues. Like, for example, factory farms is a critical issue here, and we'll hear more about that, I think. And so you click, for example, on firearms. This is a good, we start with sort of the worst case scenario. There are 43 states that preempt, most of them completely preempt local authority over firearms and ammunition. And of course, Oregon, as well as Washington, are 2 of them. And then if you click on firearms, you see the map, then all of the states that have that preemption are listed here, and we send you to the actual statutes. And so in addition to that, you can click on an individual state, in this case, Oregon, and the areas of preemption, of the 8, the areas of preemption will come up in a list. And so you can look at your state or any state. I want to talk about a few of the issues that we, well, all of these issues we're concerned about. Some of them are more active than others. But one of them is nutrition. And for example, there were recently initiatives both in Washington and Oregon to essentially, they had names that were sort of nonsense, but they were just state initiatives to preempt local authority to adopt soda taxes, which at the local level have been very effective in not only addressing obesity and diabetes and so on and so forth, but just as importantly, raising significant funds for communities, for community groups, especially for the groups that represent those who are most targeted by the soda industry. So this is an example of that, and again, one of the other issues that we look at now. We're kind of ending with the maps with the really good news, which is that not only has the grassroots tobacco control, non-smokers' rights movement stopped the passage of state preemption across the country, but 9 states have repealed preemption, and one of them is Oregon, and that is I would say that's a wonderful model, but also as we'll discuss going forward, it's much easier to kill preemption before it passes the state legislature than to spend the resources and the time, and in some cases it takes decades to repeal it. And that's true of all of the issues we deal with, pesticides to smoke-free, so on and so forth. We have put together best practices from tobacco control, but from a lot of these issues. How do you stop or combat preemption before it's adopted? And we'll run through this quickly, because if you have any questions, first of all, anyone is welcome to get in touch with us, to text or to email us, to me with Grassroots Change, and I'll share this with you. But this is a quick overview of what we found to be good ways to stop preemption. And this applies also to repealing preemption. It's a lot of work, and it takes a long time typically to repeal it, because the legislature that adopted this crap is the same legislature you're going to fix the problem. So you have the threat of preemption in the state. It hasn't been adopted in a particular issue. And there's 4 components that we look at. and we'll look at these in the next 3 or 4 slides. I'll look at these a little bit more depth. And and I don't think I have to say this to this group, but the value of stopping preemption, of not having preemption, or at least limiting preemption, is that you have local control. You prevent, by winning, you prevent future threats of preemption in the legislature, trying to make preemption an ugly word, which it should be, and an anti-democratic word, an ugly word. Not admittedly, it can be boring and it can turn people off, but our job in part is to make the word preemption a very dirty word, a third rail of politics, as they say in the state legislatures. And the grassroots movements, as opposed to there's great state legislation, and occasionally there has been great federal legislation. On the other hand, the grassroots movements across all of these issues we're talking about tonight, the grassroots movements themselves create cultural change. So that's a longer story, but the important thing is that when it's coming from the bottom up, from the people to the people, there's a cultural change that makes it significantly easier to enforce and to have the laws in place to begin with. So first, anticipating and monitoring. I won't read through these, but the critical part is pay the close attention to. Excuse me, that's my cat in the background. I apologize. Prepare in advance and expect preemption to come up in any of these issues. It is if not the highest priority, one of the highest priorities of all of these industries. Pay attention to the opposition, whether it's the tobacco industry or the industrial farming industry or whatever it is. They obviously have more money. They often have good intelligence. Pay attention to them and learn from them. And don't rely. I'm a lawyer. Lindsay's a lawyer. Don't rely on lawyers to stop preemption once it's been adopted by the state legislature. It's often very difficult, if not impossible, because as Lindsay said, groups like Alec with a lot of money, a lot of industry money, have drafted these bills that are passed almost verbatim in the state legislature. They're well drafted, and therefore very hard. You can't rely on us lawyers to get rid of them. And in monitoring the threat, it's good to look at the ways that preemption is coming up. There's, as you might imagine, there are some pretty wily and dangerous ways that preemption is coming down from the top these days. And I think it's good to be aware of the traditional ways it's come down, as well as some new ways to be aware of. Express preemption is still the most common. It's when the legislature, usually at the behest of an industry and with the support of a group like Alec, that is an industry organization, puts a well-drafted or a preemption clause into a law, and that's still probably the most common thing to look out for. The second is amendments, and what's tricky about this is that it's often these days an amendment to a bill that is more or less unrelated to the bill that's being amended, and often at the end of the legislature. We may hear some of that as we go further into this discussion. Another, which is of great concern, is fiscal mechanism. That is to say, the state legislature will pass, as they have in Arizona, for example, they will pass a law punishing cities and counties and other so-called subdivisions of the state for taking any action on any of these issues, firearms, farming, so on and so forth. And that is a way of getting it legally. It's de facto preemption, but it often has the same effect, which is to basically shut down local democracy. Another thing to watch out for these days is preemption of local taxation authority. Taxation is an interesting issue because at sometimes in some states in our history, the taxes are hard to fight against, to fight for, excuse me. So cities and counties are more likely to be able to raise the resources they need to serve their community. So one thing that is happening, and we have to watch out for, is states preempting local taxation authority. and finally, you know, all of this stuff is pretty nefarious, but it's worth paying attention to. The there are efforts to preempt, to eliminate state direct democracy. There are problems with ballot measures. However, they are one way that we can maintain our democracy against the threats that we're facing. And in those state bills that limit or eliminate direct democracy, it always eliminates the local authority to even to place these measures on the ballot, the local ballot. And I should say at this point, it's not that we're saying that what every city should do, every county should do on all these. You know, we counted 50 issues at one time that were negatively impacted by preemption. What we're saying is that the people should choose. The people, this is a democracy. The people should have that right. So another thing to watch out for is blanket preemption, as it obviously implies. It's when a state, Arizona is still an example of this as well. A state eliminates authority over a wide range of issues, often unrelated. That's been threatened, for example, in Texas a number of times, but it's only passed in a couple of places. Obviously, it's of deep concern to preserving democracy. And one technical word that's really worth knowing is a savings clause. A savings clause is simply a non-preemption clause. So not only do you want to, of course, stop express preemption, express clauses in state legislation, but every bill that we want at the state level should include an anti-preemption clause. Usually these are 1 or 2 sentences long, and they're technically referred to as a savings clause. And finally, in countering preemption, it's very important to unify allies and engage the grassroots. And what that really means is the grassroots is leading these movements. You can't really get grassroots involved in something that's coming from the top down, certainly from Washington, and not really from the states typically. It has to come from the people. And the allies in supporting state legislation need to be unified on that. And again, if the legislative solutions and if opposition to preemption comes from the bottom up, then it will by definition engage the grassroots who are leading these movements. And the final area is media advocacy, which is very important. In the opposition to the soda industry initiative in Oregon, which was defeated, the grassroots folks working on that issue and cross issues in Oregon use the media, free media, to expose Alec, for example, and it did a great job on that. It's very important to engage with the media before, during, and after there's a threat of preemption. And finally, this is me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Tim, but also from all of you guys. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Tim, if you're ready, we'd like to hear from you. And then I've been collecting questions as they've come in, and I'll shift to Q&A after we hear from you, Tim.
Great, I appreciate it, Kai, and thank you, Mark and Lindsay and everybody for being on this webinar. I just have to say first, I'm just getting over COVID. So my brain's not, I'm gonna try to connect a lot of dots and my brain's a little foggy, so I'll do my best. Also, Mark, my cat, I put my cats outside. My male cat is looking at me through the back door right now, wanting in, but I feel your pain. So sounded like a nice cat you got there. And then also just to double what Mark said about omnibus bills and the end of session shenanigans that happens in state capitals. It's real and it happens every year, and it's really disgusting. It's really not how policy should be made. It's very undemocratic. Just to do a quick intro, my name's Tim Gibbons. I'm with the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. We're a statewide farm and rural organization. We came out of sort of ad hoc organizing, farmers organizing in the 80s, during the 80s farm crisis. Farmers coming together, doing actions on the courthouse steps, organizing against their farms being foreclosed upon them illegally by USDA, but not only on the ground grassroots organizing, fighting for policy change. And what came of that through these farmers and farm families organizing was the 1987 Agriculture Credit Act, which allowed farmers to refinance their farms, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of farmers are still on their farms because of grassroots organizing that then created policy change, which is what we're working for here in Missouri, and I know we're all working for in our own respective states. We're a member-driven organization, so our members are family farmers, rural people generally. We do have people that are concerned with our food system and our democratic process in general, but we're member-driven. We learn from them. We hear what they have to say about what's going on in their communities and what they see in their communities, and what we see and what they see in their communities is a community, our rural communities that are being left behind, that are being extracted from, that are with family farmers being put out of business, our farm and food system being taken over by corporate interests, extracting all the wealth, controlling our food system at the expense of everything we hold dear. And local control is one of those things. But it's also our national security and what our democratic process really means. And I don't say democracy because I think we're actually sort of far from democracy. I think we have a corporate controlled democratic process, and we see it most at the state and federal levels. And that's why local control is so important, because corporate money and corporate influence it's not as evident at the local level. People know their county commissioners and they know their local health boards. They're their neighbors. They can go and talk to them. You know, and connecting all these dots is what we do, because it's bigger than just local control. You know, it's corporate control of our democratic process. What we have seen in Missouri and throughout our country is that the industrialization and corporate takeover of our farm and food system not only has resulted in you know, huge consolidation, but in Missouri, for example, in 1985, we had 23,000 hog producers in Missouri. They were major, huge economic drivers for our rural communities. Our rural main streets were based upon the wealth that independent family farmers were circulating in their communities. So that's 23,000 hog farmers in Missouri in 1985. As of the last ag census, we have just over 2,600. So that's nearly 90% of Missouri hog producers were put out of business. And they weren't put out of business because these corporate industrial behemoths are more efficient, which is what they like to say and they want us to believe, or because it was inevitable, which they also like to say and want us to believe. It's because of the policies that they are pushing for, and their lobbyists are pushing for at the state and specifically at the federal level. And they're doing it with our money. They're doing it with taxpayer monies, but they're also doing it with family farmers' money through checkoff programs, which is going to benefit the biggest of the big multinational and foreign industrial meat packers at the expense of family farmers, rural people, our water, our air, our food security, our national security, and what we see as being really a democratic process in the first place. Right now, and I'm not really focusing on local control yet, because this is how we talk about it. Right now, 4 corporations control over 70% of the hog industry here in our country. 2 of those corporations are foreign corporations. Smithfield is a Chinese corporation and JBS is a Brazilian corporation. They control 50% of the pork industry in this country. So 2 foreign corporations that are intricately connected to their foreign governments, control our food. And I think we've seen not only what it's done pre-pandemic, but during this pandemic, we've seen that this type of centralized control, multinational meat packer control of our food system isn't good during normal times, but during challenging times like this, they can't react and they can't respond and they don't care, quite literally. 4 corporations control over 80% of the beef industry in this country. And JBS is one of those 2. Cargill, Tyson, and then National Beef, which recently got bought out by Marfrig, which is a Brazilian corporation. So a corporation called National Beef in our country is owned by a Brazilian corporation, which is ironic. So this idea that foreign corporations are controlling our food system is something that our members really care about. And another thing that we're really bent on protecting is independent cattle production in our state. We have 50,000 cattle producers in our state. And that's connected to local control because these cattle producers are our members, and they are the ones that are fighting these industrial hog operations, moving in next to their farms, next to their communities, next to these farms that they've been on for generations. So for 20 years, we've had local control here in our state. And what local control is in our state, and excuse me while I take a drink, is county commissioners and county health boards being able to create stronger protections at the local level relative to industrial livestock operations moving into their counties. These industrial livestock operations are absentee. They're not from our community, they're not from our state, and they're not from our country. What we've seen at the state level is our state laws have been almost wholly captured by the industry. Our state capital is run by the lobbyists that represent corporate interests, and they have eroded our ability and the ability of our Department of Natural Resources, not only their ability, but also their political will to in any way hold these operations accountable to the people that have lived on their farms for generations. So these protections are simple. They're like, it's more setbacks from people's houses, more setbacks, which is just distance, more setbacks from where they spread their livestock waste to water sources, to private property, to people's property rights. These are all things that they're common sense regulations that are being put in place at the local level to protect the family farmers that have been there for generations. For 20 years, family farmers, rural people, county commissioners have fought to protect local control at the state level. Just in 2019, Senate Bill 391 got introduced. Senate Bill 391 is a local control preemption bill. We ran a major campaign. Rural Missouri ran a major campaign against the preemption of local control in 2019. Over 10,000 people, and we have the numbers, over 10,000 people took action, calling their legislators, going to the state capitol, writing letters, public meetings, and our state representatives knew that rural Missouri and Missouri in general did not agree with taking away local control. Lobbyists, not only within the industry, but also with commodity groups, the Missouri Cattlemen's Association, the Missouri Farm Bureau, the Pork Association, and a multitude of other commodity groups that are oftentimes paid with checkoff dollars, which are farmers' money that they pay every time they sell a product, every time a commodity gets sold. They hired more lobbyists. And at the end of the year, they passed Senate Bill 391. People were appalled. It just shows how non-representative our state capitol building is. Our members are suing against Senate Bill 391 on multiple counts. But the first count is that it's unconstitutional. We're saying it's unconstitutional, ironically enough, because within our right to farm constitutional amendment, which we fought in 2014, which passed by less than 0.5%, we had a sentence put in that constitutional amendment that said it was it had Article 6 of our Constitution. It couldn't trump Article 6 of our Constitution, and Article 6 of our Constitution is the local government section of our Constitution. So when people were voting for this right to farm law, they were voting for local control at the same time. Now, corporate ag didn't know in 2014 that sentence, we had to put in there to protect local control, but they didn't know it was going to be used against them in order to fight Senate Bill 391 from passing. So we're still organizing not only to strengthen state laws, but also get local control back or save local control for our local communities. One side note, which I think is ironic, is our governor Mike Parson, he is wholeheartedly for getting rid of local control when it comes to industrial livestock operations. But when it comes to COVID, he's all for local control. He is totally against, state help, work on trying to figure out how we deal with COVID. COVID, something we know very little about, that we're just learning about, that we need strong leadership on. He's saying, local communities, you do it yourself, and we're not going to give you very much money, if any money, to do it at all. When it comes to CAFOs, which we know a lot about, he says, no, the state knows better. You know, our DNR are just going to rubber stamp CAFOs and let them go wherever they want. Just to come to sort of a close, I think this shows that we have a system problem. This isn't a Democrat or Republican thing. 50% of our pork was sold to 2 foreign corporations within our current democratic process. That's a system problem. This year, we've imported, through August 2020, we've imported 2.35 billion pounds of beef. This at a time when cattle prices are in the tank. Cattle farmers are barely getting by. They're going out of business, and more often they're just leaving the business because they don't see a future in it anymore. If you're not making money, you know, why do it? They do it because they love it, but they do want to make money doing it too. And they want their kids to come back. And like, that's our goal, is to create a farm and food system where farmers are paid a fair price, consumers pay a fair price, and we can have a diverse, decentralized food system where everyone wins, as opposed to what we have right now, which is a food system where a few entities win and we all lose. And just to close, we're doing this all with our money. Our taxpayer money is being used to industrialize the corporate takeover of our farm and food system. It's done through the guaranteed loan process. It's done through EQIP, which is NRCS conservation dollars, that our taxpayer dollars are going to these corporations for them to manage their manure. And then another thing that we really fight for, which is key here, which shows that the system is broken, is country of origin labeling. We are wholeheartedly for our consumers knowing where their meat comes from, where it's born, raised, and harvested. And you know, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Corporate Ag, they took that away from us within free trade agreements and the World Trade Organization and NAFTA, which is a major problem. It's another dot that's connected because it's the globalization of price, and the price that is set globally by these multinational grain traders and commodity traders is a race to the bottom. So it's a race to the lowest possible price they can buy it for. They undercut farmers, not only in our country, they undercut farmers across our world, all in the name of feeding the world, while they put farmers out of business all around our world. That's just a little bit of how this is happening. There's a lot of other dots that are to be connected, but they're not difficult to understand. They're actually pretty easy to understand. And unfortunately, agriculture and the industrialization and corporate takeover is a perfect example of how our democratic process is broken. And that's what we're doing here at Missouri Rural Crisis Center, is organizing with farmers and rural people and Missourians in general to fight back against that corporate takeover. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. And thank you, Lindsay and Mark. I've been watching chat, and I've picked up a few questions that have come in while each of you were talking. And I'm just going to go in order as they had come in. And anyone that wants to jump in on answering it, feel free. Let's just kind of do it that way versus assigning you guys questions. So the first one that we got from a viewer was this question, which is, how do we get local elected officials to lobby for the elimination of preemption laws that hamper them? So kind of a broad question around, how do you get local elected officials to do the bidding to I guess gain local control, as you were putting it, Tim. So I don't know who wants to kind of jump on that in the sense of what you've seen or what you would advise.
We have county commissioners going to the Capitol, and they did it anyways. Industry influence and big money is powerful. It's scary a little bit, because when you have, the Missouri Cattlemen's Association and the Missouri Farm Bureau against you, it takes some guts to stand up against that type of money and that type of power. We do have county commissioners and health boards that are not only coming to the Capitol, they're also involved in this lawsuit fighting Senate Bill 391.
Mark or Lindsay, anything to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, there's statewide networks of cities and counties. I know here in Washington State, the Association of Washington Cities that I'm involved with in my elected official capacity has local control as one of its, kind of default lobbying points during the legislative session at the state. There's also the National League of Cities, which is basically a network of all the state networks, which recently put out a report by several law professors called Principles of Home Rule for the 21st Century. And it is a report that addresses a lot of the structural issues that we've been talking about here and proposes a model law for basically a model constitutional amendment for trying to make some of the reforms that we've, that we could talk about more, a reality, basically trying to fix some of these problems with the weaponization of preemption. So I don't know, I think it's probably an individual, elected official question of, what they're spending their time doing and if this is a priority. At the state level, I think there is a really legitimate question of how much do the state legislators who pass laws realize that there's a preemption clause in them? How much are they paying attention to that? Are they actually negotiating that? Or is that just something that's slipped in as if it's boilerplate, the fine print at the end of a document that you don't bother reading? So the more that, as Mark said, we can call it out and make preemption into a dirty word, the better. The more it's just intolerable that a elected official at the local or state level would stand for this kind of interference with local democracy, all the better. And I say the word democracy having followed the chat comments on democracy. So I'm ready to address that as well if folks want.
Yeah, I mean that's the comments about democracy are very well taken. Having said that, the local elected officials have been in some cases wonderful, as Tim described, and worked very, very hard. However, in some cases, individuals, in this case farmers, but also individuals, consumers, just people in the community can bring a certain passion to grassroots campaigns that can help defeat preemption and also ultimately, in theory, pass laws that are for the people, not against the people.
Thank you. I think a couple of you already touched on this. I know, Lindsay, you did directly. There's a question around, is there a history of Alec promoting preemption provisions? So I don't know if any one of you want to jump into more just on Alec's role in the spread of state ceiling preemption and not just agricultural realms, but they've had their hands in a lot of different arenas.
I mean, we're all going to say something about that. That's a great question. And the answer is yes. Like these industries, like industrial farming industry and so on, CAFO industry, Alec has made state preemption and therefore model state preemption legislation, which they promote, an incredibly high priority. And it's been the case at least for 20 years, but it's getting worse. So Lindsay, Tim?
Yes.
So yeah, and the whole patchwork argument, we need uniform regulations. All of that is really just an Alec talking point. I'm not sure if they came up with it, but they're definitely perpetuating it. Of course, it caused some problems when they started to move into local government model bill writing, because at that stage, then they didn't want to talk about this, how bad a patchwork was because they were promoting a patchwork themselves. But we all seem to be more concerned about hypocrisy than the corporate business class do. So don't worry about the hypocrisy, move on ahead.
And I would like to, Paul brought up in a private chat that, I said the system's broken. And he's right. He said the system's not broken. It's working perfectly
right
as it's supposed to work. It's just, it's broken for all of us out here in large part, but it's working perfectly like they're writing it.
I'm going to show my ignorance on this next question, and to maybe save myself a little bit, I'm going to repost it in the chat here. I'm not entirely sure what the COC is standing for. I have a suspicion, but if you guys get a chance just to read that, and if any one of you want to jump in to answer that, please do so.
So this is part of the reason why when we're saying preemption,
Yeah.
a lot of times we're really using shorthand for ceiling preemption. And to be clear, the idea of floor preemption versus ceiling preemption isn't something I remember hearing in law school.
Right.
It's more of a concept that is coming out of those of us who say, you know, there's a problem with this blanket test, if you will, that the courts apply, where, you know, if there's a conflict between state law and local law, then state law always wins. It's like, should state law always win? Or sometimes it makes sense for the local law to be immune from state preemption. So that immunity, I think, is a valuable concept here. It's not that the local law is going to supersede state law or overwrite state law or upend the system of federalism that we have in the United States. It's that the local law is able to do more of what government is ultimately supposed to do. I mean, government is supposed to protect people's rights, health, safety, and welfare. At some point, and maybe now might be a good time, I want to do a little quiz that I came up with when Mark and I did some radio interviews last week, trying to strum up interest in this talk that we're doing now. So put your thinking cap on, so to speak, because I'm going to read a quote from a document that I'm sure you've heard of this document, but you might not know this line from it. He hath refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. End quote. So, you know, this is somebody, you know, refusing to allow others to make laws for the public good. Here's another one. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. And the next line, in case you don't know it yet, he has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. All right, I see some guesses coming out there. He is, yes, King George. Although Dan Meek, that FDR reference is pretty funny. Yeah, so those are lines from the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, we usually think of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that line. But, you know, the Declaration of Independence is really saying, hey, you know, if we're going to revolt and rebel against this tyrant king, we should probably justify it to the rest of the world, because we want France to think we're independent so that they help support us in the war. And so these are the grievances we have against the king. And what I read were the first three grievances, and all of those had to do with the colonists not being able to make the laws that they felt they needed for, as they said, the greater good, the public good. That is really the same critique of preemption that we're making today, of government should be about people making the laws that they want or need to make for their own locality.
Thank you, Lindsay. This next question is pointed really at you, Tim, and it comes from Simon Davis Cohen, who you know, which we had talked about this with you in the lead up for having you here tonight, which is maybe spending a few minutes talking about what you guys have done to kind of bridge that rural-urban divide and sort of the reality of sort of multiracial, I guess that we're all in the same boat, so to speak, and that it's not just a rural issue or an urban issue, it's really a people issue. And I know you guys have done a lot of active work in that arena, and I think it'd be interesting for people to know a little bit about what that's looked like and in what ways you've tried to, I guess, unpolarize the so-called polarization that's out there.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of polarization out there, the very intentional and polarization. You know, Missouri Rural Crisis Center, stemming out of the crisis of the 80s, there was a lot of desperation going on in the 80s. And when there's desperation, people look for people to blame, and they look for like ropes to grab onto, you know, people like groups to help them. And the groups that were out there, some groups were the posse, the KKK, supremacists. And our executive director, Roger Allison, or our former executive director, who's a family farmer in Howard County, Missouri, you know, he said something that I think is really poignant, which is farmers and rural people can't exist in isolation. And in response to that, he brought farmers together, and he brought Jesse Jackson out to rural Missouri. And Jesse caucused in rural Missouri, and people voted for Jesse Jackson in rural Missouri. He brought the Jewish Relations Board out from Kansas City into rural Missouri to talk about the issues that were affecting farmers and rural people, and connecting those issues to the issues that were facing urban people. So it's in our history. More recently, what we've been doing is working with other organizing groups that represent people of color in urban areas. Our group is called the Missouri Organizing and Voter Engagement Collaborative, MOVE. And what we do is we bring our members together with their members in experiential sort of situations where we can talk about race, racism, class, and come together and talk. And really, it's very uncomfortable, very intentionally uncomfortable. And the goal is not only to have our leaders and our members go back to their communities, and when they hear this divisive talk, they can say, well, that's not what I experienced. You know, that's not what I experienced. And then those leaders in their communities can help, you know, develop a feeling of unity in their communities with their family and their community. But then also bringing our leaders together to work on issues and work on campaigns together. We worked on a passing Medicaid expansion in Missouri just earlier this year. So working with these organizations around issues that matter to all of us. Our executive director, our current executive director, Rhonda Perry, wrote an op-ed that went into the St. Louis American a year ago in 2019, about local control. St. Louis wants local control of their police force. We want local control of industrial livestock operations, and making that connection, not only organizationally, but within the media, and then pushing that out there and showing those type of relationships that we have, and the similarities we have as opposed to the differences we have. COVID has really gotten in the way of us being able to meet in person, but Zoom has really enabled us to continue this anti-racist work that we're doing as a white organization, with other organizations that represent people of color, and organizing together. We're organizers, and we want to be with other organizers that are fighting for justice.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. If you have anything in particular, as far as an article or link you want to drop in chat for folks about that particular endeavor, feel free to do so. I'm going to skip over one of the questions. I've been going in sort of chronological order as they've come in, just to kind of put it out to the other panelists versus being Missouri specific. This question was, what's happening with international trade agreements that allow multinational corporations to sue local areas / states / nations for labor or environmental protection laws, which the corporations say rob them of future profits? Any one of you want to kind of tackle? That's a big question, and but yeah.
Tim maybe, I have something to say, but Tim may go first because he's dealing directly with these international issues, and we have in tobacco as well. But Tim?
Well, I mean, free trade agreements are a major problem. You know, they want to take away the right to the court system. They want to take away the right for us to label products. They want to take away, and I think Steve King was one of the main drivers of trying to take away the ability at the federal level, local control through free trade agreements. We haven't, you know, I haven't really seen it, but I know it's an argument against some of these corporate written free trade agreements. that, they're trying to, not only take away local control or control of our state or control of our federal, our federal laws. They want carte blanche control over everything. They don't want us to have anything. And any way that they can take away any power that we have, they're going to do. And that's why we need to organize for, a real democratic process. Right.
And so the tobacco example, very briefly, is just that the industry having lost in some arenas, they've got vaping, and they've gone international, as everyone knows. The tobacco industry, the large companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, and as part of that, they've been responsible for what is a form of international preemption, where the international organizations and industries essentially have these agreements, and can use them to preempt not just state or local legislation, but federal legislation as well. Domestic public health, health and welfare legislation, social justice legislation can be, in essence, preempted at an international level. Very, very, very bad.
We've got a question here on kind of back to Alec. The question was specifically, how does Alec legislation show up in Oregon? I don't know if any of you will kind of know that in particular around Oregon's realities, but maybe just speaking overall, like some of what I guess happens either visibly or in the background when it comes to organizations like that. And I suppose I'll make a little addition here beyond just Alec, what can you provide in the sense of what it looks like when corporate lobbyists get together and do their thinking and their acting. I'm sure each of you have your own experiences there that you could share just on that general question of not just Alec in specific, but corporate industries.
Alec is the model, and they've been incredibly successful. As Tim says, the system is working for Alec and its members, are the industries we're talking about who invest a great deal of money into Alec, and the state legislators who, in essence, work for them. But I think others may want to add, Alec, you can't do this work without being knowledgeable about Alec.
I made the Alec reference to the model state Pesticide Preemption Act, and then Oregon's Oregon Pesticide Control Act, and same year. It's pretty tied in connection there. I have not researched other laws in Oregon and their connection to Alec model bills, but Alec's website does have a lot of its model legislation online, and that could be cross-checked with like the Oregon City's preemption guide that Dan Meek posted in the chat earlier, and or even just search terms in the Oregon statutes website to see. I'm not sure if somebody's done that already specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a cadre of legislators in Oregon who are basically taking what's coming through the corporate, the corporate advocacy group and pushing it out in law. Again, that's just speculation.
And you reminded me, Lindsay, there's the Center for, it's the group that runs Alec Exposed. You can that's the best way to find it, is Alec Exposed. It's the Center for Media and Democracy. Fantastic group, and this is at the core of what they do. They've actually put out on they have actually put on their own website Alec model preemption legislation that they've gotten a hold of by going to Alec meetings without actually saying who they are.
I'm going to pause just on questions that came in for a second and throw it back to the three of you to, I guess, bring into this conversation anything that either hasn't been brought up, or maybe some points that need some more explanation or expounding on, or just some other edges to the conversation that you want to throw in the mix here. And then I'll get back to a couple other questions before we wrap it up. So yeah, I want to give you guys the opportunity to do that.
Well, we're talking a lot about preemption, which is good to deep dive into because it's often the first line of defense by the corporate state against democracy. That said, it's not the only defense, and there's other kind of intersecting areas of law that corporations can use to, put down efforts by people to defend themselves using the law. Corporate rights is another area, and I think Oregon Community Rights Network is doing a workshop next month on corporate rights specifically. The structure of local governments under the federal contracts clause, Dillon's rule, home rule, those sort of principles all play a role here as well. We can look kind of at the system of property and who gets to be property, what is property, what has rights. All of those are issues that can be used to stop us from using government to protect the people.
Mark or Tim, anything at this point before we get back to a couple more questions and close out tonight?
Very quickly, I just we've touched on this, and I want to say it explicitly. Preemption is in many ways like voting rights, in the sense that it is a core structural issue for, in democracy. And I agree with many of the comments in the chat that it is highly debatable what the nature of our democracy is at this point. But having said that, preemption is in there as a tool of industry to undermine what democracy we have.
And I'll just say there, at least the entities that we're fighting against, they're making money on COVID. They're using it as a way to have more power, make more money. JBS just came back and they had a nearly ninefold increase in profits this last quarter. So they're making money hand over fist usually, but during pandemic, they're making more.
Tim, there was a question around your awareness of other groups similar to yours in the Midwest, whether in Iowa or in other places that are doing similar work. And if you want to speak to that or drop things in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, no, we work, we have a coalition called the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, which is Missouri Rural Crisis Center, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, Iowa CCI, Land Stewardship Project, which is in Minnesota, Dakota Rural Action, which is a South Dakota-based farm and rural organization. And then we also have two national groups, Food and Water Watch and Institute for Ag and Trade Policy. And we're working on federal issues in order to get farmers paid and to protect farm and rural families and our food system and our democratic process. It's pretty wonky. I mean, the stuff that we work on from a federal policy angle is pretty farm and rural based, but making sure that farmers get paid cost of production plus a living wage on top of it, which is like a radical thought. Issues like that through supply management and antitrust enforcement. The lack of antitrust enforcement in our country has really done a detriment to our economies and our food system and our democratic process in general. The more power they have, the more power they get, and it just keeps going up. So these larger issues of antitrust is something that we really are fighting hard for, and fighting for a farm bill that actually is made for farmers and consumers, not made for multinational corporations.
You'd brought it up, and there was a question that quickly came up after you'd mentioned JBS and its profitability in this time of the pandemic. And the question was, how does the pandemic allow meat packers to make more money than they would normally?
How is it happening? Well, they're importing more beef right now. They're using their inability to run packing plants with their immigrant labor, who they marginalize and take advantage of. They're using that as an excuse to import more beef. They can label the beef product of the United States, which is asinine. They're also making money through the CARES Act. You know, they're getting money from our pandemic relief. So, you know, they're making money any way they can. Rosa DeLauro just wrote a letter to Sonny Perdue just last week, calling on stopping federal taxpayer dollars from going to JBS, because JBS just got caught price fixing, where they had to pay millions of dollars to the Department of Justice for price fixing. They just got caught bribing elected officials, and then they just came back with record third quarter profits. So, you know, illegal behavior is paying off for them.
There was a question that came in earlier, which is there ever a time when preemption can help a local control cause?
Typically, only when it's floor preemption. In other words, when the state or the federal government set meaningful and protective floors of protection or in any issue, but allow states and particularly local jurisdictions to pass stronger protections for the individual, for example, for family farms. That ceiling preemption, when it's not ceiling preemption, it's floor preemption, it's fine, basically. But maybe Lindsay can call on his wonkiness.
Do I get the wonkiness award of the three of us? I think that's still being competed amongst. And hopefully there'll be a survey at the end where people can decide who's the most wonky.
Yeah, I mean, Tim hit us with the international trade agreements, and that just, wow.
Yeah, I'm going with Tim at this point. So to me, in some way, preemption and local control are antonyms. I'm not sure that those can fit together. That said, there are some issues where it's sometimes really challenging to decide how, you know, what the right policies are. I know, you know, here in Washington State around affordable housing policy, you know, some of us who are really advocating for affordable housing have been split about how, you know, should we advocate for some preemption because some cities aren't doing what they're supposed to. That for me is a really tough issue because I don't believe in preemption as a principle, and yet at the same time, I do feel like sometimes we need the state to move in. That is not, you know, advocating local control. That's more advocating that floor, that the state would set the floor that cities and counties can build on top of. There was a related question about in rural areas, maybe it's about less regulation. And you know, I think that's where, you know, we should say, yeah, the state is setting the minimum and localities can go above that. But if we look to the state to set a uniform standard across the entire geography that is within its jurisdiction, we are, you know, setting, you know, in the case of I think rent control is a good example, the same rent control standard for Portland as rural parts of Eastern Oregon. I don't understand why that is a uniform policy that preempts preempts local governments. Yeah, single family zoning and ADUs in Oregon as a comment. So, you know, is that a minimum standard? In my mind, yeah, I mean, we're over zoned for single family zoning. So what the state is saying is, look, like, you know, if you're in an urban area, you need to accommodate this amount of population growth. I can look at that within the floor ceiling preemption dynamic and say, you know, that's a minimum standard, and cities are able to go above that. Now, somebody else might say, well, no, my single family white picket fence, Whitopia community is actually, you know, the protection I want. So we do get into this challenge when we're talking about protecting public health versus protecting private property rights. You know, there's not really a neutrality sometimes when we really dig into this, and we have to recognize that this question, even the idea of government exists to protect health, safety, and welfare, that phrase is actually fought over, and the terms that get to be included in it are fought over. At the beginning of this, you know, 100 years ago, governments could not protect health, safety, and welfare. The U.S. Supreme Court was saying No, liberty of contract, this liberty you have under the 14th Amendment, prevented governments, state and local, from having minimum wage laws, from having workplace safety laws, from protecting people in ways that we now consider very basic. That was seen as a constitutional right by the courts. And it was only through concerted organizing by mostly the labor movement in connection with laws passed by local governments and state governments continuously fighting that principle set forth by the court, that after several decades did the court finally relent. And really, we know the story. It's the switch in time that saved 9. When FDR sat down at a fireside chat and said, the time has come to save the Constitution from the courts and the court from itself. And instead of packing the court decided to switch on this liberty of contract issue and began to say, no, wait a second, I guess health, safety, and welfare, that's something that local governments can pass laws for, states can pass laws for, and began upholding things like minimum wage law. So, this is a 100-year-old battle and we're coming back to it. Preemption is a new weapon, just like liberty of contract was 100 years ago. I'm not sure if it's preemption or the deregulatory First Amendment, but one of those seems to be the favored tool, maybe one at the state level, one at the federal level, in order to simply stop us from the passing laws that we need to have a government that works for the people.
Lindsay, I'm going to use that as your close. I don't know if you knew that, but I wanted to give Tim and Mark a minute or two to make any last comments, and then I have one announcement before we say goodbye here.
Yeah, I'm just honored to be here, and I'm just very impressed with all of you, and thank you for including me. That's all.
Yeah, nobody should have 10,000 sows next to their farm and next to their home.
Right.
You're going out on sows, Tim?
Going out on sows. I mean, it is these are the one thing about organizing, and for as long as I have, is these people are like my best friends, and it's difficult to see what they have to deal with. It's heart-wrenching. And not only that, they're going out of they're not making any money. I mean, they're talking about leaving. It's a sad state, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Well, to the three of you again, thank you very much for not only being here, but to your point there, Tim, the day-to-day grind that this work is all about. I know a number of the people that are here today, and there's similar work happening in other places in the way that you described there in Missouri, Tim. And there was a question around Oregon in specific, what's happening in this idea of what can we do to kind of counter, push back, or eliminate the overreach of state power. And the Oregon Community Rights Network has had that sort of eye on the prize idea around that for a long time. And they are making an attempt this upcoming legislative session to put an amendment in place that basically would legalize local democracy and really put more power in the hands of people and local governments. There's actually an information session about that amendment effort. That's going to be a proposed constitutional amendment. There's an info session tomorrow, 2 of them, one in the afternoon, one in the evening, and then one again on December 3rd. I'm going to drop an email address into chat for those that are interested in either attending the session or just finding out more about what's happening there. So I guess that's our little plug at the end about an action being taken, at least in Oregon, to counter what we've been hearing from the panelists tonight. I think that's it. Again, thank you everyone for making the time. Tim, get better. I'm glad to hear that you're on the upswing there, and appreciate everyone being here tonight. I will send around, or the ORCRN will send around a link to tonight's event. Also, we will save the chat. People talked about the chat, something you can do on your own now if you wanted, but I will save that and also send that around to anyone who registered for tonight's event. So you'll have all the comments and the links and the information there. And again, very much appreciate you being here tonight, and take care, everybody.